Altitude training with a specific focus on endurance athletes. Altitude training consists of conducting workout routines in an elevation of approximately 5,000 feet or greater. Many athletes and coaches believe that this method of training is extremely beneficial, with elite athletes often integrating periods of altitude work during competition preparation. There are many perceived adaptations of altitude training. It is believed that altitude training induces a natural blood doping effect, increasing red blood cell concentration, leading to a greater aerobic capacity. Another popular belief is that altitude training increases lactate threshold velocity, thus improving muscle buffering capacity, or the ability to better compensate for the rise of pH levels in the muscles, heightening resistance to fatigue. Although these adaptations are actual recorded adaptations in the human body, how sound is the underpinning scientific theory? During this presentation, I will discuss why athletes use this method of training, the adaptations that occur due to this training, and the scientific theory that encompasses this method, and finally, the ethical argument that surrounds altitude work. There are two main methods of altitude training: live high and train high, and live high and train low. Coaches and athletes worldwide have accepted the idea that altitude training, living and training high, benefits sea level endurance performance. In a discussion between 4 experts on altitude training for athletics, the average best altitude and best duration at altitude were at 2,200 meters for 4 weeks. These coaches also came to the decision that the effects of altitude training were optimal 2 to 3 weeks after returning from altitude. In the live high and train high regime, an athlete lives and trains at a desired altitude. This ensures that the body is constantly stimulated by the hypoxic environment. Initially, VO2 max drops drastically by almost 8% for every 1,000 meters above sea level. Athletes will no longer be able to metabolize the level of oxygen as they would at sea level. Any given velocity must be performed at a higher relative intensity at altitude compared to that at sea level. One suggestion for maximizing adaptations and maintain performance is the live high, train low ideology. This training idea involves living at higher altitudes in order to experience the physiological adaptations that occur, such as increased erythropoietin levels, increased red blood cell levels, and higher VO2 max, whilst maintaining the same exercise intensity during training at sea level. Due to the environmental differences at high altitude, it may be necessary for athletes to decrease the intensity of workouts. As mentioned, high altitude is accompanied by a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, which in turn leads to a reduction in the driving pressure for oxygen transport and a corresponding fall in VO2 max. Thus, it is easy to see that one confounding influence on the outcome of altitude training is the progressive decline in VO2 max, which comprises training intensity, leading to detraining at altitude. Altitude training causes many adaptations in the body. It is no secret that altitude training increases one's aerobic capacity. Altitude residency naturally boosts a runner's blood concentration of erythropoietin. EPO is a powerful hormone synthesized in the kidneys that stimulates bone marrow to increase production of red blood cells. As red blood cell density increases, the blood is naturally able to carry more oxygen per unit volume due to the increase in hemoglobin levels. This results in increased oxygen levels leaving the heart per beat, thus increasing one's VO2 max. An athlete who is able to increase his or her VO2 max is often able to achieve higher levels of performance. This relation between EPO, red blood cells, and VO2 max is often used as a justification for altitude training. Recent research of the effects of altitude on the human body has shown another physiological bonus linked with altitude work. When performing exercise at altitude at any intensity, blood lactate levels are higher compared with performing exercise at sea level. Heightened blood lactate concentrations during workouts have been linked with a greater increase in lactate threshold velocity, an accurate predictor of performance. Scientific support for this hypothesis is minimal. However, in fact, it is much more difficult to maintain speeds greater than sea level lactate threshold velocity at altitude, and thus total time spent above lactate threshold velocity during training can actually decrease at altitude. Various research has suggested that training or living at altitude may enhance an individual's running economy, another sound predictor of endurance performance. The Australian Institute of Sport carried out research to investigate the effect of altitude residency on running economy. 9 elite athletes spent approximately 400 hours at a simulated altitude of 9,367 feet in an altitude chamber. However, they carried out their training at sea level. After 7 weeks and sleeping at simulated altitude for 46 nights, the athletes at simulated altitude had an improved running economy by about 4%. The control subjects failed to improve at all. A similar study carried out in Tokyo, runners who slept at a simulated altitude of 3,000 meters for 29 nights heightened their economy by roughly 5%. However, athletes that slept at the same simulated altitude but trained at sea level did not enhance their running economy at all. The findings of this research suggest that altitude or simulated altitude training improves running economy in runners who have previously lived at sea level. Unfortunately, the process that underpins this mechanism is unknown. Exercise scientists have been hard pushed to demonstrate the specific adaptations linked with work at altitude. As a matter of fact, one of the first investigations regarding the use of altitude training revealed that it could be quite detrimental to performance and health. This experiment placed well-trained collegiate runners in a hypoxic environment for 9 weeks at an elevation of 4,000 feet. After returning back to sea level, the runners then repeated the exact same time trial completed before altitude exposure. The athletes ran 3 to 8% slower compared to their previous attempt. Similarly, other follow-up studies conducted at more moderate elevations struggled to link altitude training with specific performance advantages such as capillary growth around the muscle cells, intramuscle pH regulation, and an upgrade in respiratory capacity. There are two good reasons for banning a practice that enhances an individual's performance. Either it causes illness or injury, or it gives the athlete a technological advantage that is too expensive or too new for most other competitors to access. So, are the methods of altitude training truly ethical? Living on a mountain is obviously ethically acceptable, and frequent trips down to the valley are also unlikely to be considered unsporting. But aside from the temporary altitude sickness, is altitude exposure damaging to health? In a small proportion of individuals, excessive production of red blood cells increase the risk of sudden death through blood clotting or myocardial infarction. A Belgian amateur, Johan Sermon, 21, died of a heart attack in 2004 after a stage during an amateur cycle meet. His death was put down to the use of EPO after extensive clotting in cardiac veins. Johan, as an amateur rider, would have found it hard to find the time and financial input in order to correctly conduct altitude training, hence, which could be the reason for the use of EPO. It is this pressure of the performance which is worrying governments and governing bodies. On the other hand, continuous exposure to altitude leads to accumulation of fluids, edema, in the lungs and brain, which can be fatal. However, the average athlete who spends a few weeks at a moderate altitude will not have these problems. So what can athletes do in order to acquire these advantages without actually leaving sea level? Altitude chambers, nitrogen houses, and nitrogen tents are all used to mimic a desired environment. The use of this apparatus can be dangerous if the simulated altitude was at such level to raise the thickness of the blood to an unsafe level. An athlete using a personal altitude chamber or tent could well possibly overexert themselves, causing serious damage, especially without professional supervision. However, so far, no one has made a public case for banning these devices on the grounds of health and safety. It also seems unlikely that they will be banned as an expensive innovation, as this specialist equipment is no more expensive than the high-tech equipment that is used in training or performance by many elite Olympic athletes. If numerous training methods and equipment aren't unethical, are they unsporting? Perhaps. Somehow it's less objectionable if the individual athlete pursues this avenue or performance enhancements via a personal altitude chamber or tent. Still, it would be a very sad day for the endurance sport when all athletes feel the need to spend large proportions of their lives in such apparatus to enable themselves to compete with other competitors. Some individuals ask if this apparatus can be banned. The short answer is no. Because you can't ban normal altitude training, therefore it's unfair to ban a safe practice that makes it easier and cheaper for athletes to achieve the same effect. It is imperative to highlight that this practice in question are only unsafe if the blood doesn't become too viscous. Many governing bodies have brought in laws that protect athletes' health and also help to identify doping. They have done this by setting limits either on the proportion of blood cells, the hematocrit, in the blood sample, or on the concentration of red blood cell protein, hemoglobin. Current research will eventually answer the questions regarding which test is more effective, where to set a fair limit, and how to control athletes attempting to cheat.